Hello again, everybody. So for this video, we're going to try to look at the Watergate break-in and how it eventually brought down President Richard Nixon. Now, as I mentioned in the last video, the Watergate break-in was orchestrated by one of Richard Nixon's covert campaign operations, the Committee to Re-elect the President, which was actually supervised by his, at the time, Attorney General, John Mitchell. And basically, what Creep had been involved in was a variety of different dirty tricks, operations trying to sabotage or otherwise undermine Democratic opponents, um, leaking false reports to the media, eavesdropping on conversations, planting illegal bugs, and things like that. And that's exactly the type of operation that Creep was involved in when they were caught on the evening of June the 17th, 1972, trying to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. They were trying to plant a bug in the Democratic National headquarters in the Watergate Hotel um, after a first bug had stopped working, basically. And so the arrest of the five Watergate burglars attracted considerable media attention at first. But the Nixon administration very quickly um, disavowed any involvement in the break-in, referring to it as a quote third-rate burglary, um, and for the most part, initially people took that denial at face value, and it had very little bearing or effect on the 1972 election. Although Democrat George McGovern did try to bring up the Watergate break-in repeatedly. During the campaign, it attracted comparatively little attention and headway. That all changed after Nixon won re-election, when the five Watergate burglars who were caught on in June of 1972, along with two other Nixon associates who were implicated by the burglars, E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, were put on trial by Judge John Sirica. Um, Eventually, that trial concluded in early 1973, and all of the burglars were convicted of various crimes, and several were sentenced to long prison sentences. Um, as a result of this, one of the burglars, James McCord, wrote a letter to Judge Sirica in which he claimed that he had been coerced into perjuring himself in exchange for monetary payments, a bribe basically, and at the behest of the Attorney General, John Mitchell, and the Nixon administration's in-house counsel, White House counsel, John Dean. And so, as a result of this revelation, along with additional revelations made to Washington Post journalists Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward through an anonymous informant that they referred to as Deep Throat, whose identity would eventually be discovered in the early 2000s, was Assistant FBI Director Mark Felt. Um, by early 1973, the Watergate break-in once again was in the news, and once again was attracting significant attention. Amongst other reasons why this was, is because in the course of investigating the Watergate burglars, it was discovered that all of the Watergate burglars, including the men who had directed their activities, were all either former CIA or FBI officials with close ties to the Nixon administration and to Attorney General John Mitchell, amongst other people. And so, as a result of this, renewed investigations are called for. Eventually, a Senate investigation is called for and is chaired by Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina. And various witnesses are at this point interviewed for this investigation. And it's at this point that the Nixon administration um, does a variety of things that eventually will bring about its downfall. Um, there's still to this day considerable question as to whether Nixon himself personally ordered the break in to the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel. But what is known for certain is that once word of the break-in reached Nixon in his White House, he immediately became involved, deeply personally involved, in covering up the break-in and any potential involvement his administration and the committee to reelect the president might have. And it was ultimately this cover-up, more than the break-in itself, that would eventually be the source of Nixon's downfall. In the course of several months of investigation, which Nixon aggressively attempted to stonewall in various ways by invoking executive privilege, eventually Senate heard testimony from various witnesses, including White House counsel John Dean, who was, along with uh, White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman and Chief Advisor um, John Ehrlichman, released by the Nixon White House, basically an attempt to, kind of throw them under the bus. Um, his testimony ultimately testified to deep involvement by the Nixon administration. Um, Eventually, Dean's testimony, which was put forward in the spring of 1973, was corroborated in a manner when another Nixon associate, um, Alexander Butterfield, under testimony, admitted to the existence of tapes that Richard Nixon had privately recorded. Nixon's deep-seated sense of paranoia extended to the point that he recorded all of his conversations, even with his closest associates, without their knowledge. And so once knowledge of the tapes became widespread, um, Senator Ervin and various others, along with those working the criminal investigation, sought the release of the tapes. Nixon partially complied with this, but refused to release the full, unedited tapes to either the congressional investigations or to the investigations being done in Judge Sirica's court. Ultimately, in the face of growing public pressure, President Nixon eventually appointed a special prosecutor, Harvard Law professor Archibald Cox, to head up an independent counsel. Cox continued to press for the release of the Nixon tapes, which Nixon continued to resist releasing. Ultimately, as Cox continued to fight for the release of the tapes, and as Nixon felt increasingly cornered by the investigation, he eventually shocks the nation in the autumn of 1973 by firing Cox. And basically, this sets out a chain reaction. Basically, Nixon got fed up with Cox for his continued subpoenas for the release of the tapes. And so he orders his attorney general to fire Cox. When his attorney general, Elliot Richardson, his new attorney general, he had three, when Elliot Richardson refused to fire Cox, Nixon compelled Richardson to resign. He then asks the deputy attorney general, John Ruckelshaus, to fire Cox, and Ruckelshaus refuses and fires Ruckelshaus. And then he proceeds to ask the Solicitor General, Robert Bork, to fire Cox, and Bork complies. This event, in which Cox, Richardson, and Ruckelshaus are all fired, pretty much in one after the other, comes to be known as the Saturday Night Massacre, and it marks a pivot, a turning point in public relations, in which the public begins to really suspect that the Nixon administration had been engaged in some pretty heavy-duty wrongdoing. In the course of this investigation, because of the secret leaks being made to Woodward and Bernstein by Deep Throat, as well as because of aired testimonies, the public became aware of a variety of things, including the existence of the White House plumbers and how they had engaged in various illicit efforts like breaking into the psychiatrist of Daniel Ellsberg, the man who released the Pentagon Papers, as well as the existence of a White House slush fund funded secretly by covert donors that was used to finance a wide range of dubious and oftentimes illegal activities. And so, following the Saturday Night Massacre, coupled with all these revelations that are coming out in the press, public opinion begins to turn against Nixon. And Nixon, hoping to salvage the situation, eventually decides to hire a new independent prosecutor, um, the head of the American Bar Association, Leon Jaworski from Houston, and hopes that that's going to, kind of settle things. Well, Jaworski doesn't go along with it. He decides to keep pressing for the release of the tapes. Nixon continues to claim executive privilege, and this eventually reaches its way all the way to the Supreme Court in the summer of 1974. In a case called United States v. Richard Nixon. So the United States, the people of the United States are the plaintiff, and Richard Nixon is the defendant. Eventually, the Supreme Court finds that Nixon's claims for executive privilege were not warranted. In that particular case, a unanimous decision, which included 4 of Nixon's own appointees, and they order the release of the tapes. Nixon then complies with this order, although one of the tapes contains a notable 18-minute omission that to this day remains a subject of considerable mystery and debate as to what exactly was on it during those 18 minutes. In spite of that omission, what is released in those tapes, as well as a subsequent tape that Nixon releases later that same summer, they implicate Nixon heavily in the cover-up, indicating that he had pressured the FBI through the CIA to drop the investigation, that he encouraged people to lie under oath, and really had engaged in a variety of other crimes. And so at this point, the House votes to impeach Richard Nixon. And facing a solidly Democratic majority in both the House and the Senate, Nixon, by this point abandoned by his Republican colleagues in Congress, who basically, tell him the gig is up, he finally announces his resignation on August 8th, 1974, and is then replaced the following morning by his vice president, Gerald Ford, who had himself replaced the previous vice president, Spiro T. Agnew, when he left office under his own cloud of unrelated scandal owing to bribery charges stemming from his time as the governor of Maryland. So that brings about an end to an inglorious period in American politics. Nixon's downfall, again, largely is because of his own sense of paranoia, his own desire to crush his adversaries. But his downfall ultimately rests on 2 things. There are 2 elements present in the Watergate investigation and that eventually forced Nixon to resign that are just not present in many other subsequent political scandals involving American presidents, whether we're talking about the Iran-Contra scandal or the impeachment of Bill Clinton or the more recent impeachment of Donald Trump. And that is that first, there was a smoking gun implicating the president in direct wrongdoing, ordering the cover-up, and ordering people to commit perjury and various other crimes. and engaging directly in obstruction of justice. Um, but beyond that, there's also the fact that um, there was a that Nixon faced a solidly Democratic um, majority in the Senate, which almost certainly would have voted to convict. So really, there were two principal components in the Watergate saga that have not been present in other um, you know White House scandals since, and that is that both there was direct evidence, which has existed in other instances, but moreover, and perhaps more importantly, there was a congressional majority in the Senate that was eager and willing to vote to convict and to remove from office. So um, take with that what you will. Um, but yeah, so the Watergate saga ends Nixon's presidency on a dubious note, but it really, on a more significant level, is important because it furthers the erosion of an already shaky trust that the American people had in government that had been steadily eroded throughout the 1960s and early 70s, starting with the lies that the Johnson administration had told about the Vietnam War. Um, the Watergate scandal and all that it entailed really was just sort of icing on the cake. And it really marks the beginning of an era of profound disillusionment and profound distrust that'll have major repercussions and ramifications for American politics and American history going forward.